Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 242, Longstreet and Rosecrans. Last week we talked about who deserves the title of worst army leader in the East. Generally speaking, we usually mention two individuals, John Pope and Ambrose Burnside, so we laid out their campaigns, and hopefully now we have a better understanding of their decisions, and then formulated an opinion on who gets that label. This week we turn back to analysis. I think we have unsung heroes in this episode that are not without their criticism. This week we need to talk about James Longstreet and William Starke Rosecrans. Of course, before we do that, let's talk about Patreon content, and we did have an episode here recently where we talked about Appomattox, and we read an account from Appomattox, and that was Edward Porter Alexander, and we paired it with a picture slideshow. We went back to a memoir review, so kind of going back to that well, and we did Hell on Belle Isle, and that is going to be specifically about Civil War POWs, so that one we've kind of teased for a little bit. I think we've kind of had a good mix of memoirs here in the past. We've done quite a few different looks here. This is our first one that we've done that's specifically been revolved mostly around a POW's experience, so that gives you a good idea of what that would have been like, right? Spoiler alert, it was not a particularly fun time to be a POW in 1863, so buckle up for that. That sounds like it would interest you. Any kind of picture slideshows, movie reviews, we have a couple movies that are still on the list for us to review that are coming down the pike. If any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. So the pairing of these two particular generals might seem strange. In fact, so far on the analysis series, we have not done a Confederate and a Union general at the same time. On the surface, it might seem like they really do not have a whole lot in common. Rosecrans is serving in the West or Subtheater. He is commanding at the Battle of Chickamauga, where Longstreet is present, but other than that, there's not really a huge connection. If we look beneath the surface, then I think there is a lot more that they have in common. For one, the significance of their contributions is taken for granted, perhaps. Longstreet never really has an independent command, if you exclude Knoxville, where he doesn't really do a whole lot. Rosecrans has this huge loss, as already mentioned, at Chickamauga, that really mars his record and overshadows the rest of his service. Both are not without their controversy. Longstreet, of course, famously has Gettysburg as an example of a questionable performance. Along the same lines, he gets involved with the Western Clique, a kind of political affiliation where he is angling for his own command. For Rosecrans, his controversy surrounds him sort of being annoying for the War Department. He is too much like McClellan, a Catholic, and a Democrat. Significantly as well, the treatment of both of these men after the war really shapes many perceptions of them. We have mentioned before about how Longstreet becomes a Republican after the conflict, and thus is labeled a traitor by many Southern veterans, notably Jubal Early. This is also really tied into the lost cause narrative as well, so keep that in mind. There's a lot that gets kind of spun a certain way, and we'll talk about that here as we continue on in the episode, but it's also where you get a lot of the whole, he didn't really do a whole lot at Gettysburg, and he dropped the ball at Gettysburg. While we cannot be surprised with Longstreet, he is sort of a moderate, and also a good friend of Ulysses S. Grant prior to the war. The fallout of this decision is still felt into the modern day. As a result of this supposed betrayal, there would be a lot of blame and criticism heaped on what is otherwise a competent general. For Rosecrans, we mentioned the loss that really makes people question his competency. Like many generals who bumped heads with Grant, as well, there's going to be some maybe unfair criticism after the war. We have talked before about how history is written by the winner, and sometimes the winner is able to even shape the story from the winning side. I do not think I'm talking out of turn when I say that Grant is the winner. He becomes president. He is the hero of the war. When Rosecrans fails, history will write about how he did not know what he was doing and had a breakdown, but this may not be entirely accurate. Remember, the same kind of treatment is drawn out for George Thomas, but Thomas does not have the decency of having a major disaster on his record for Grant. Not only does he perform well in the disaster of the subtheater, but he is also able to make Franklin and Nashville the final nails in the coffin of the secondary Confederate field army. Had he lost at one of these, then there's no doubt he gets the Rosecrans treatment, hysterical at the loss of Nashville and outside of his depth. I think these are unfair criticisms for Rosecrans and Longstreet, so hopefully, in this episode, we can shed some light on their careers. James Longstreet was born in South Carolina in 1821, but spent most of his formative years in northern Georgia. As always, we can always see some kind of insight into how these individuals turn out with their upbringing. In northern Georgia, Longstreet would be in a particularly rural part of the state, and would therefore be a little different than the southern aristocracy. As a result, he was not so concerned with politics, which we can connect to his eventual acceptance with the Republican Party. Not many who would have grown into this more elite and refined class would have turned from being a Democrat even after the war. In 1837, James would obtain entry to West Point. Longstreet would not do particularly well in school, although he would learn under Dennis Hart Mahan, if you recall, a professor whose impact is felt on numerous officers. Longstreet would graduate 54 of 56 in the class of 1842. This class would include several other officers, including John Pope, who we just talked about, Alexander Stewart, Lafayette McLaws, Abner Doubleday, Earl Van Dorn, and Longstreet's roommate and subject of the other part of today's episode, William Starke Rosecrans. Longstreet would be attached to Zachary Taylor and his army prior to the war with Mexico. Unlike other individuals we have talked about before, he seems to get quite a lot of hands-on experience on the battlefield, serving in the 8th U.S. Infantry. Participating in the battles in the northern part of the country, he would be part of the troops transferred to serve under Scott. He's going to personally lead a charge during the Battle of Churubusco and be wounded in the leg at Chapultepec. Famously, he would hand the colors to another young officer, George Pickett. Pickett is going to ride this experience all the way, seemingly, to Gettysburg. Actually, not only is he going to ride that experience all the way to Gettysburg, he's going to ride this relationship with James Longstreet all the way to Gettysburg. So, keep tabs on that. Longstreet was a brevet captain for his heroic actions during the battles. Following that conflict, he would bounce around in various army positions, serving for a time on the frontier and as a paymaster at Fort Leavenworth. James would marry Louise Garland in 1848, 10 children being born to their marriage. We know that Longstreet probably had a large part of his family life being an impact upon him. There are several accounts of his change following the death of his 2 children during the war. Their deaths in 1862 would be a noted event. William Starke Rosecrans was born in Ohio in 1819. He was really set from the beginning to serve in some kind of military capacity, as his father had been an adjutant for William Henry Harrison during the War of 1812, and his middle name came from the Revolutionary War general John Starke. Starke, of course, is famous for being present at many early battles of the Revolution, including Bunker Hill. Young William would work as a clerk in Mansfield, Ohio, before his appointment to the U.S. Military Academy. In that same class as Longstreet, he would graduate 5th. Impressive for not having received a formal education. It's actually really impressive considering all the things that we talked about with West Point. Remember, right? If you were like a guy like McClellan, who comes in already being able to speak French, and you have already had this kind of stellar education going into West Point, you're already set up really for success. Whereas if you are on the other end of things, if you're a guy like Stonewall Jackson, who has kind of already had to sort of fight and scrap, and maybe you have a very minimal education, if really any at all, then you're going to have a hard time, considering like really kind of your classes are going to really be more about math than anything else. So imagine that, right? If you don't have really kind of any sort of foundation to go off of, and then all of a sudden your manuals are in French, or like, your classes are all about kind of these really hard engineer-based kind of math problems, then you can imagine that being very difficult, right? He would meet his wife at his graduation, Anna Elizabeth Hedgeman, the marriage producing 8 children. So that's another similarity there. Not only was he a roommate of James Longstreet, but they both had a good amount of children. He would serve as an engineer during his early career and returned to West Point to teach. It was while in New York that he converted to Catholicism, several members of his family also converting, his brother becoming the first Catholic bishop of Columbus. After several engineering posts, he would resign from the army in 1854. Rosecrans was unique from some of the other officers we talked about in that he did not participate in the Mexican-American War. He would go into business, designing a lock and dam system in Western Virginia and partnering to create an oil refinery. Rosecrans did show his aptitude for invention as well, a kerosene lamp holding a patent. Famously, he would be injured by an oil lamp exploding, William growing a beard to hide the scars, but also creating a perpetual smirk on his face. We know that Longstreet was involved from the very beginning of the war. He would join the Confederate States Army as opposed to maybe lesser or more administrative roles that he could have attained in state outfits. He would be described, though, as a real soldier. A most striking figure, about 40 years of age, a soldier every inch and very handsome. Tall and well-proportioned, strong and active, a superb horseman, and with an unsurpassed soldierly bearing, his features and expression fairly matched. Eyes glint steel blue, deep and piercing, a full brown beard, head well-shaped and poised. The worst feature was the mouth, rather coarse. It was partly hidden by his ample beard. Finding himself under PGT Beauregard, he would be involved in the first real skirmishing of the Eastern Theater in the attempt at Blackburn's Ford. Longstreet's troops would perform well in the repulse of the Federals, who, to be fair, superseded the reconnaissance orders by Irvin McDowell. Longstreet might have been one of the first officer casualties of the war, as he had to duck out of friendly fire. He would find himself under Joseph Johnson, a sort of partisan for that general during the Peninsular Campaign. Longstreet reportedly endorsed Johnson's idea to shift fronts back to Virginia, and perhaps take the war to D.C. rather than wait for McClellan to roll up to Richmond. Longstreet was promoted to Major General, and would be given a key part in the operation during the Battle of Seven Pines. Much like First Manassas, this would be a complicated game plan. Longstreet would not understand fully his orders, or at least perhaps misremember what they were. He would advance on the wrong road and blame Thomas Huger for the error, really throwing him under the bus. As a result, during the first day of fighting, neither force would make it to the field, where the full weight of the Confederate army might have done good in making Seven Pines or Fair Oaks a more significant battle. As Lee takes over for the wounded Johnson, Longstreet would find himself in a pretty significant role yet again, as he was the most senior remaining from the old setup, Gustavus Smith resigning. He would be involved in the attacks at Gaines's Mill and see Lee's first victory. It would be the added weight of his command, some saying Canamus Wilcox breaking the first line. That would see Fitzjohn Porter's troops in their defense. Again, Longstreet would serve hot work at Glendale, which was a real opportunity to cut off McClellan from getting to the river. A determined defense would see this effort stymied, and Jackson, as we have talked about in some of our previous episodes, does not engage the Federals in an action that really might have been turned in the rebels' favor. Longstreet would take on the mantle of being a wing commander following this defense of Richmond. He's going to perform well at Second Manassas. Much has been made of Jackson's role in that battle, but Longstreet successfully holding Pope in order for this flank maneuver to be launched, and then driving home the victory with a flank attack of his own on the third day would be just as important. As we get to Antietam, we can see an increased importance of Longstreet. Where Jackson sort of fails to impress, Longstreet is animated on the day. He successfully ships reinforcements and holds down the center long enough. Reportedly, Longstreet is going to sight an artillery piece while his staff man the gun. Being able to shift enough forces to finally check the Federals on the rebel right following the stand of Burnside's Bridge is also going to be important. Lee is going to dub Longstreet his old warhorse at the conclusion of the fight, which shows you the significance of his role. At Fredericksburg, part of Longstreet's wing would receive the majority of the Federal attempts on Burries Heights. Now, he didn't really have to do much, but his troops are still going to be able to repulse them. Late 1862, early 1863, we have James Longstreet being more involved with the Western Clique, individuals who were under the impression that the war would be won or lost in the subtheater, and that more resources should be shifted to meet that need. Pete himself would wish to be moved to join Bragg and his army, possibly taking over for Bragg, who we know was ailing in terms of health and was probably more ready to give up command. Thus we have Longstreet and his Suffolk campaign moving into North Carolina and briefly striking toward New Bern. Part of the move was to gather supplies, which he did, and relieve the pressure of the logistical network that was moving toward Lee and his army. Besieging Suffolk would be a diversion. In the meantime, Lee would be engaged with Hooker at Chancellorsville, utilizing the divisions left behind by Longstreet to great effect. Some have pointed out that maybe James Longstreet could have made better time in getting back to aid the embattled Lee, but there is evidence that in the face of the enemy, he did the best he could to get there as quickly as possible. As it was, he did accomplish his mission of gathering much-needed supplies. At the eve of the Gettysburg campaign, he would be seemingly Lee's right-hand man with the death of Jackson, and much is made as to the thought process of his relationship to his commander. Again, he would push for his assignment to the west, but Lee had his shift of operations north of the Potomac in mind and would need Longstreet for that effort. Some argue Lee was probably not so impressed with the concept of Pete in independent command, while I think it is also telling that he wants to keep him around because he's in need of a competent officer. I think also Lee understands the limitations of his other corps commanders. He's kind of forced into a position where obviously he had two very capable individuals in wing command, right? And we've talked about this before, but you had Longstreet and then you had Jackson, and you had a very capable kind of setup there where you were kind of on the same page as those individuals. And much is made of how Lee is more on the page of Jackson than Longstreet, and that's kind of part of the problem. I don't necessarily subscribe as much to that, right? But certainly you probably can make the argument that those three individuals are more on the same page than A.P. Hill and Ewell are to any of them, right? So Lee definitely understands the limitations of these individuals, and obviously, hindsight being 2020, you're going to see the limitations of them as we get into 1864. So he needs to have at least one guy that he doesn't have to worry about, and that's going to be Longstreet. The Battle of Gettysburg is Longstreet's controversial performance. He disagrees with Lee about the battle location, but Lee does not want to give up the ground already gained and shift. Longstreet's corps and their attack on the southern part of the line does come very close to working, albeit there is a miscommunication with McLaws, which causes the countermarch and then gives time for reinforcements to shuffle into various locations, including a Little Round Top. If you're a Little Round Top was actually where the Army of the Potomac was saved person, I'm not really that kind of person, but if you are, there you go. But obviously, it does give a lot of time for more troops to be moved around, right? Pickett's division being deployed on the second day as opposed to the third was really a possibility, but it was too late in the day. Longstreet's overall commitment to the battle plan is called into question, him reportedly being lethargic on the second day, but again, the execution is there, and the wounding of Hood is important to the overall drive of his division. The third day is the puzzling day for Longstreet. He kind of lets Edward Porter Alexander decide if they're going to attack, which is sort of a strange move if you're Longstreet. You could probably argue that, we're getting to the stage, at least we're kind of at least well on our way there, that, frontal assaults and just kind of these direct bashing assaults are less and less effective. And, especially as we get into 64 in the latter stages of that year, they're just not going to work at all. So you could say from that perspective that he's going to kind of understand that. He's going to kind of understand there's going to be a lot of casualties in this assault. And, he's kind of reluctant to do that because, you obviously got to break some eggs to make an omelet, right? But, it's going to be a tough situation, and it's going to be a tough situation for Pickett, who, again, he hasn't really done much. So he's kind of this untested guy. He's really been riding off this experience that he had a long time ago. He is definitely the guy who's sitting at Applebee's talking about how he played quarterback in high school. If we can make an analogy about him, I don't know if that's necessarily fair. I'm sure you all might disagree, but that kind of is accurate in terms of his experience during the war, because he gets wounded at Gaines's Mill, and that's pretty much the only action that he sees besides Seven Pines. And in those battles, you probably are sitting here like, he was at Seven Pines, and yep, he was. So there you go. And, obviously, maybe that's where you have this reluctance of Longstreet to actually commit to this attack on the third day, when, again, he's more under the idea that the plan should be to actually shift fronts and get Meade to attack you, because he thought that was the idea, right? That was what they had decided when they first went into Maryland, right? Let's find some ground. Let's make Meade attack us. If we're attacking him, that's a problem, right? That's not what we decided. So obviously there's all these factors that you can say, well, okay, that's probably why. It's not less so that he's dropping the ball and he's not as gung-ho for the Confederacy, gung-ho for actually wanting to try to win this battle, right? Again, it leads to us pointing out that Pickett's charge does almost work, so I find it strange when the execution is still there. Late 1863 would see Longstreet finally be granted permission to join Braxton Bragg, and a weird move, he's given sort of operational control at Chickamauga, despite being unfamiliar with the army and the terrain, but we talked about that in Bragg's episode. As it was, Longstreet would be in charge of the assault on the final day, which does break the Union line. Now, I've seen a lot of back and forth on whether the old warhorse really does deserve the praise or not, and that is an interesting question. There's a lot of factors, being the movement of Wood's division and the fact that the terrain makes lines a tactical problem, and then Hood gets wounded, and there is less of an inspired follow-up, but again, the execution is there. And the point I'm trying to make by that too, right, in Gettysburg and in Chickamauga, the two largest battles of the war, right, the point I'm trying to make, and when I say the execution is there, it's kind of the same thing. When you listen to my episode that I did on Phil Sheridan, and I say that the guy won, and no matter what you think about his campaign for the Valley in 64, was he just kind of getting lucky there? Was it tactics? Was a little bit of both, right? But at the end of the day, he wins, right? And for these two battles that you can be critical of the guy, you can say, maybe there was a little bit of lethargy. Maybe there were certain factors that, maybe he wasn't a genius in this attack at Chickamauga, right? But the execution is still there, right? So you can say what you want, but it's kind of the same opinion that I have of Phil Sheridan, in that it's still there, right? It still happens the way it does. Longstreet, though, is not going to do well at Wauhatchie, which might have been a real opportunity to keep Hooker and the 11th and 12th Corps from opening a supply line. He gets involved in the politics of the army, and remember, he was angling for independent command anyway, but this is going to shoot himself in the foot. He'll be shifted away from Bragg in a failed attempt on Knoxville, where an assault is just going to rack up some unnecessary casualties. McLaws and Evander Law will both be on his list post-Knoxville as a result. Longstreet's going to winter and then operate in this Tennessee, Southwest Virginia area, but eventually he's going to rejoin the Army of Northern Virginia. The Wilderness in 1864 would be the last significant contribution of Longstreet, and again, might have been highlighted for good execution, but marred in his accidental wounding. He first was able to stop what might have been an attack that would have rolled up Lee's army. His timely arrival to the field would stop this effort, and then his counterattack would almost return the favor. Had Longstreet remained on the field there are those believe, a la Jackson, it might have turned the tide. This wound would be severe, but it would not be fatal, Longstreet returning to command in time for the Appomattox campaign. In the beginning part of the war, Rosecrans is going to find himself attached to George B. McClellan as he builds up his army in Ohio. He would be in the field during the victories at Cork's Ford and Rich Mountain. Remember, as we have talked about before, Little Mac's presence during many of these engagements is questionable, but it does allow for a star to rise. Rosecrans, especially at Rich Mountain, rolls out an aggressive flanking maneuver to get around the Confederate forces. In a time when Union victories were needed, he was at the forefront of providing them and securing Western Virginia for the Union. As a result of his efforts, however, he would be sidelined. Fremont is going to take over the Mountain Division. This might have been fortunate for Rosecrans, or maybe not. Rosecrans commanding in Fremont's stead would have been interesting for the Valley Campaign, and in my mind, would have removed the criticism of Stonewall Jackson facing these inferior generals, quote-unquote. Rosie would find himself attached to Pope's army as it moved on Corinth, Mississippi. He would remain in this region under the supervision of Grant. Unfortunately for both, I think this happens at a time when Grant is sort of depressed, having been himself sidelined, thinking the war for him was almost over. At one point, he does consider resigning. Having an individual with a penchant for bumping heads with their superior might not have been the subordinate for Grant at the time. Grant would remove himself to Memphis, returning to attach himself to O.C. Ord's command, Rosecrans commanding in the field for the Iuka and Corinth battles. Iuka would be an attempt by the Union forces to trap Sterling Price. Ord would pause, waiting for the sound of fighting, but due to an acoustic shadow, remember there are certain instances where actually an acoustic shadow is going to be a problem, notably Perryville, there's actually a big problem with an acoustic shadow in that battle, but Iuka is another situation where there's an acoustic shadow that becomes a big problem as well. Due to this acoustic shadow, he is not going to arrive, and Price is going to escape. Rosecrans would receive praise, and Grant would be criticized for not moving with Ord to his support. Rosie would again command at Corinth, receiving an attack from Price and Van Dorn's combined forces. Outnumbered and driven the first day, the Union forces would be able to hold off the rebels on the second day, saving Corinth before reinforcements arrived from Grant. Rosecrans and his performance have been subject to debate. I have seen some positive, some negative. We know that Rosecrans was fairly animated during combat and often gave contradictory orders, kind of a fidgeter. I would argue, though, that offensively, Rosecrans had displayed his prowess, and he was able to hold his own in an encounter battle at Iuka and then a defensive battle at Corinth. His failure to pursue the retreating Confederates would lead for more conflict with Grant, who wished for a more vigorous pursuit to eliminate them. Successes would lead Rosecrans, though, to command the Army of the Cumberland. He would take over and then immediately start to bump heads with the War Department, though. Edwin Stanton was not a fan of his from his brief time in the East and would continue to not be a fan of him when he was at the head of the Army of the Cumberland. And this is what I'm kind of talking about with Edwin Stanton. If you listen to my Patreon episode where I talked about the series Manhunt, it's kind of odd that we did Edwin Stanton as the main character in that. Like, he doesn't like anybody, right? Like, why is, it's kind of weird. But anyway, listen to that and you can figure out my thoughts on Edwin Stanton and my thoughts on Manhunt, that Apple series. At this time, there was needed movement by the Union Army, a victory necessary, especially following the whirlwind of the fall of 1862. Spurred into action, the Army of the Cumberland would advance toward Murfreesboro. Here they would engage the Confederates under Bragg, possibly one of Rosecrans' finest hours. He would rally his troops in the face of the aggressive flanking attack, forming a defensive line around Round Forest, and then staving off an additional attack 2 days later. Rosecrans would be lauded for his victory, especially happening so close after the disaster of Fredericksburg. Rosie would then continue to campaign, albeit with some prodding by the War Department. The Army of the Cumberland, though, would be moving through the inhospitable areas of East Tennessee, and thus supply and careful planning would be needed. Tullahoma would be a campaign without a major battle, but important in securing almost the whole of Tennessee for the Union, happening into July, combining with the victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg. Gettysburg, though, was the largest battle of the war, and the goal of capturing Vicksburg was also tangible, especially with the surrender of the Confederate forces there. Despite being impressive, but not without the Confederate errors, Rosecrans rightfully felt that he was the short stick. He would capture Chattanooga in another bloodless move, a city that had been on the wish list for a year. Continued spurs for action would lead to the Chickamauga campaign. We can sort of be sympathetic in that Rosecrans is outnumbered. As we mentioned, not only did Longstreet arrive, but additional Confederates from abroad would join Bragg. A big problem, though, is going to be that once the line is broken on the second day, there would be an exodus of officers back to Chattanooga, including Rosecrans. Had he remained on the field, would there have been any difference to the outcome? Perhaps not, but perhaps he might have been able to save some face. I think not only is it a problem that there's an exodus of officers from the field, right? But Charles Dana is also present, right? And, it's not even the fact that Charles Dana is present. He's actually requesting to have an escort back to Chattanooga, right? And that's actually what removes Wilder's brigade back to Chattanooga. And Wilder's brigade might have actually done some good work on the field. They might have been able to stay. And George Thomas does remain, and he does a good job. But you have McCook, Crittenden, Rosecrans all gone back to Chattanooga, and that gets reported back by Dana, and that is a problem. So obviously that's not good for anybody's career. None of those guys are going to have a good career after that. Once in Chattanooga, the situation would appear to be dire, but Rosecrans and Baldy Smith would be hatching the Cracker Line plan. Grant's arrival, though, would prove the end of William Starke Rosecrans and his tenure in command. He simply had rubbed too many people the wrong way, and one big blunder that leads to his negative perception. Post-removal, he would be commanding the Department of Missouri during Price's raid. It is possible that Rosecrans might have been considered as Lincoln's vice president had he been a popular general and was a war Democrat. Lincoln often wrote of Rosecrans and his significance. We have a note here. My dear General Rosecrans, when I wrote you before, I did not intend, nor do I now, to engage to an argument with your military questions. You had informed me you were impressed, through General Halleck, that I was dissatisfied with you, and I could not bluntly deny that I was, without unjustly implicating him. I therefore concluded to tell you the plain truth, being satisfied the matter would thus appear much smaller than it would if seen by mere glimpses. I repeat that my appreciation of you has not abated. I can never forget, whilst I remember anything, that about the end of last year and beginning of this, you gave us a hard-earned victory, which, had there been a defeat instead, the nation could scarcely have lived over. Neither can I forget the check you so opportunity gave to a dangerous sentiment which was spreading in the North. Yours as ever, Lincoln. This ultimately would not come to pass, although President Rosecrans would have been an interesting possibility. William Starke Rosecrans would resign from the Army in 1867. Longstreet, post-war, would have an interesting journey. He would find himself in New Orleans, failing at a few business ventures before the election of Ulysses S. Grant to presidency. Longstreet was a supporter of the Republican Party, differing from his fellow former Confederates, something that did not get him many friends. But Pete was more interested in securing a place at the table rather than letting the party be dominated by the black majority. His thoughts, though, are summed up in this quote: "Men can't all think alike, and the trouble with the Southern people always has been that they won't tolerate any difference of opinion. If God Almighty had intended all men to think just alike, he might just as well have made but one man. My opinion is that the only true solution for Southern troubles is for the people to accept cordially and in good faith all the results of the war, including the Reconstruction measures, the acts of Congress, Negro suffrage, etc., and live up to them like men. If they do this and encourage Northern immigration and treat all men fairly, whites and blacks, the trouble would soon be over, and in less than 5 years the South would be in the enjoyment of greater prosperity than ever." Longstreet would serve as a general of militia during times of unrest in Louisiana, actually commanding armed black men in the effort, which again added to those who sought to detract from his accomplishments. The lost cause narratives indeed were strongly against Longstreet, and many outright blaming him for Gettysburg and the loss there. While refuting these claims, the old warhorse would continue to serve in politics through the Hayes administration, including being minister to the Ottoman Empire. He would go into retirement at 65 in Georgia, but still would be involved in certain instances, including campaigning for William McKinley in 1896, and he would wish to lead troops in the field during the Spanish-American War. James Longstreet would actually die in 1904, which is fairly surprising, as he surpassed many of his fellow officers. Rosecrans would go into railroads and briefly be the minister to Mexico after the war. He would foray into politics initially, but would be elected to the House of Representatives for California in 1880. Rosecrans had purchased a large amount of land in California prior. He would go on to be the chair of the House of Military Affairs Committee, where he again would combat Grant, opposing a bill to provide Grant a pension. On Grover Cleveland's election to the White House, Rosecrans would serve as Registrar of the Treasury in 1885. He would die of pneumonia in 1898. I have paired Rosecrans and Longstreet together because, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, I believe they are both in a similar boat of being overall underrated, and part of the reason is the criticism they received that may be unwarranted. Longstreet has his alignment with the Republican Party, and Rosecrans has his rivalry with Grant that extends even into his political career. Both suffer as a result. As mentioned briefly, I think William Starke Rosecrans shows he is one of the more well-rounded generals of the war. This might be a shock, but if we look at his record, we can see he is able to succeed in a variety of engagement types. Offensive action as a check, encounter battle, defensive battle, fixed engagement, campaign of maneuver, all of these he succeeds in. We really only have one dark mark against him, and unfortunately, it is a big one, and that kind of dooms him. Let's take his rival Grant. Does he fight in all these types of engagements and actually succeeds in them? Does Grant even really fight an encounter battle? I don't even really know. Maybe Champion Hill, right? Sure. Okay. Pemberton's not really that big of a issue, I don't think. Okay. But I would even argue that his campaign of maneuver is sort of a failure in the end. Vicksburg being a good example of a success, while Champion Hill is only real encounter. It's sort of kind of a problematic in some ways. Shiloh, maybe you can classify in there, but you can make a strong argument that Confederates win the first day, and it's the reinforcements and offensive action on the second day that wins it. Longstreet consistently turns in good performances, on the other hand. He gets the results and execute actions well. I think while he does not shine at Knoxville, he was not really set up well there to succeed. I would also argue that just because he does not do well independently, this should not diminish him as an effective combat leader. In some ways, he is a better complement than Jackson to Lee. I think that while both have their flaws, for instance, they have their negative performances and also bump heads outside of the battlefield with their superiors, both are generally underrated figures that have a larger impact when you look a little deeper. So let's end the episode there. Hopefully we have a better appreciation for James Longstreet and William Starke Rosecrans, but you can make your own opinions. Next week we return to our unit series. We talk about the 14th Brooklyn. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.